Welcome back. And today we are going to continue on with the peripheral nervous system. So this is going to be the first video about the peripheral nervous system, an introduction to it. So when we're talking peripheral nervous system, we're talking everything in the nervous system excluding the brain and the spinal cord. And so what does that encompass? It encompasses anything that has the word nerve in it, because as you recall, nerves are groups of axons that are traveling outside the central nervous system. So that means we're going to have cranial nerves. We have 12 pairs of cranial nerves we'll learn about in great detail later on. In addition, we'll have 31 pairs of spinal nerves we'll learn about as well. We have what we call nerve plexuses, which I'll try to explain. What you need to understand about the peripheral nervous system is that some of these nerves are going to only have a sensory component. They're only going to be carrying messages towards the central nervous system, whereas other of these nerves are only going to have a motor component, carrying messages out of the central nervous system towards the effector organs. However, some of these nerves are two ways. They're going to have sensory afferent messages from receptors, and they're going to have motor efferent messages for the effectors. So just a quick review, when we're talking about the motor subdivisions of the peripheral nervous system, we have the somatic nervous system, which is voluntary. So that's only your skeletal muscle. And then we have the autonomic nervous system, which is the involuntary portion. So that would be your glands, your smooth muscle, and your cardiac muscle. And in fact, that autonomic nervous system, as we'll see in a subsequent lectures on the autonomic nervous system, we are going to divide into two huge categories, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And then we'll also talk about the enteric division, which has both sympathetic and parasympathetic components. So let's get back and just talk about the somatic nervous system of the peripheral nervous system. Because as I said, autonomic nervous system components are going to be totally different lecture. So when we're talking somatic, we are talking both sensory neurons carrying sensory information from those receptors, like all those receptors we learned in the skin, like the Pacinian corpuscle and Merkel disc and Meissner's corpuscles, the lamellar corpuscles, as well as sensory neurons coming from muscle and the muscle spindle, in the Golgi tendon organ. So we're kind of done talking about the sensory part, and what we're going to focus on today are the somatic motor neurons, conducting impulses from the CNS only to skeletal muscle. So to understand the peripheral nervous system, we have to understand what a nerve is. Okay. So what we have first is we have an axon, okay? And each individual axon, it could be myelinated, having that beautiful myelin sheath with, has to be Schwann cells because we're not in the central nervous system, or they could be unmyelinated axons. And groups of axons are going to be put together to form structures known as fascicles. Do you notice this is exactly the same term that we had when we talked about groups of muscle fibers becoming fascicles? And then the groups of fascicles, along with blood vessels, are going to form a nerve. Now, just like we had in the muscle, we're going to have connective tissue coverings. However, we're not going to use that suffix mycium like we did in muscle. Instead, we're going to use the suffix neurium. So surrounding the axon, there's always going to be an endoneurium. So we may have an axon, then a myelin sheath, and then an endoneurium, or we just may have an axon surrounded by endoneurium. Around fascicles, we're going to have perineurium, and around nerves, we're going to have epineurium. So since we've covered this before, I think you're probably pretty good and you understand this concept. So I'm going to give you a picture here, and you should pause and try to figure out what everything is. Okay, so I hope you got that. And if you have any questions about it, be sure to let me know. So let's talk about those nerves, realizing that some of them are afferent. In other words, they're sensory going towards the central nervous system, and some are efferent. So when we're first, let's talk about the afferent nerves. So these are our sensory neurons. Their cell bodies are going to be located in those spinal ganglia, structures known as dorsal root ganglia. So they're going to have dendrites going towards that cell body, this lovely pseudo-unipolar neuron, which then has an axon, which is going to go in through the dorsal root to go into the dorsal horn to synapse with an interneuron. And from there, we can have interneurons which either come out at the same level, or more of them actually ascend up into the brain to bring the information to the sensory part. Think that post-central gyrus of the parietal lobe. Okay. In contrast to that, when we're looking for a motor message coming out, we would have descending tracts coming down from either the primary motor area or the motor association areas, for instance, in the frontal lobe. And that would come down to the anterior horn of the spinal cord, where we will find the cell body of our efferent nerves located. Its axon will exit through the ventral horn. Remember, there is no ventral root ganglion, so it just travels. And then when you're in the spinal cord, you will have the motor neuron going one direction and the sensory neuron going the other direction. So the spinal nerve is a mixed nerve. Okay. Now, what happens when you cut a nerve? Okay. And here's the example of the classic Sunday morning, somebody wants to cut a round bagel, and instead of putting it on the cutting board and cutting like this, they hold it in their hand so they can cup it. And what you don't realize, if you cup at the bottom of the bagels here, which means you are going to have to cut part of your hand in order to completely cut that bagel in half. Well, the first thing I want to point out, if you cut your hand, please do not put duct tape on it and continue to eat breakfast before you go to the emergency room, okay? Just leave the bagel for somebody else and go get your hand taken care of first. So what happens with this? If the damage on the axon is close to the cell body, then the entire neuron is going to die. And what that means is if it was sensory going up, everything distally is going to die off. But if it's motor coming down, then there are not necessarily things dependent on it. Okay. And so the top picture is showing what happens with a good hand surgeon, and that is we try to attach those connective tissue coverings of the two cut ends back together. And hopefully you'll end up with a beautiful, nice linear scar like the ladies whose hand it's in the bottom right picture. Now, there's no guarantee that things are going to work out and you're going to have beautiful motor and sensory function. So let's see what happens to that injured nerve. Okay. So the first thing that's going to happen is if you have cut the axon, everything from that point distally to the terminal boutons is going to die. Okay, because there's nothing that's coming down from the cell body to supply it. Okay. Now this can take time. For instance, if you have a nerve that's quite long, it's going to take a long time for that distal part to die. So this is anywhere from 3 days to a week where this is dying, and now we have this dead tissue. Okay, and notice we've also cut Schwann cells there, and so we have this whole side of damage that a normal inflammatory response is going to occur. Now I realize you don't know what that is because you don't learn about inflammation until you get the cardiovascular system, which is in the second semester of an A&P class. It's in the last half. So basically, we're going to have a bunch of macrophages come in and clean up the debris. And this inflammatory process in a normal person with good blood flow lasts about 10 days. Okay, so that's why I wrote 1 to 2 weeks. Okay, so the macrophages hopefully clean up all the debris and everything is ready to go, and your body is trying to heal normally. And so what happens after about a week after injury, growth factors are being released. Okay, and what this causes to happen is new cells, new Schwann cells are going to form, and they are going to line up and create a tunnel. There's no axon inside them yet. They are actually creating the tunnel. Meanwhile, what the axon has done is exactly the same what happens if you take a buzzsaw to the top of a tree, and that is at close to the site of amputation, a whole bunch of little sprouts are going to come up. Lots of little filaments, okay? Now, hopefully the filaments will go inside that regenerating Schwann cell too. And then what happens is one of those axon filaments becomes the dominant one, okay? And so all the other ones basically are going to die off, and you're going to end up with a single axon filament that's going to enlarge, and it's going to be completely ensheathed with myelin, okay? And then this axon filament's not only enlarging in diameter, but it's also going to start lengthening. And we really know how fast this happens. The lengthening of it happens about 1 millimeter a day. And so after about 2 weeks, you can kind of check the sensory growth of this axon. For instance, if you cut yourself here, give it a couple of weeks, and about a month after injury, you should be able to have feeling to the base of the digits. And then you can kind of map it as that axon is going further and further. Now, the shorter the distance that we need neurons to travel, the better chance there is of having a successful regeneration of that nerve, whether it's a sensory neuron or a motor neuron. So that's peripheral nervous system. So let me diverge just for a second and talk about what happens in the central nervous system. Okay. This doesn't happen there. And the reason why it doesn't happen there is because those Schwann cells, they were only in the peripheral nervous system, and they're encouraging this to happen. Whereas in contrast, in the central nervous system, we have those oligodendrocytes, and they are inhibiting this axonal growth. Okay? And that all has to do with immune responses and our traveling immune cells in the central nervous system realizing this cell is not normal, and so it tries to clean out everything that's abnormal. So if we compare humans to other animals, it's very interesting because what we find is that the animals that have the highest degree of immunity, immune responses, or what's called immune privilege, and humans were very developed because we have both non-specific and specific immunity, we have the least amount of regeneration. But if you compare us to a frog and a fish who have very little immunity, they have massive capability for regeneration. So, one slight caveat to that. In the last 5 years or so, we've had a lot of really interesting research being done on, can we create new neurons? We've always known that in developing brains of children, they have what we call neuronal plasticity, in which if a bunch of neurons are destroyed, other neurons can kind of develop and take over. And we know that continues to a much lesser degree, but still quite significant through high school and the college and early 20s. Okay. But by the time you're your parents' age, it has been pretty well recognized that the neurons you have are the neurons you're going to have for the rest of your life. But this new research has shown that in the part of the limbic system, what's called the hippocampus, where we're going to have a lot of learning and memory formation going on, we actually have shown that with attempts at learning we can generate new neurons in this area. So we do have this capacity for lifelong learning. So although you may not be able to teach a dog, old dog new tricks, you should be able to, okay? Because dogs have less immune privilege than humans. And we know that your grandma and great grandma can learn how to use the apps on a cell phone. All right, so let's get back to peripheral nervous system. This is the end of this introductory compartment, and the subsequent parts will be talking about spinal nerves and about cranial nerves. I want to thank you for all your hard work, and I will see you again soon.